So if you take that Greek form from 4Q120 in the Dead Sea Scrolls and you combine it with what we find in Elephantine, there's an Aramaic form of God's name, which is Yahweh, that's really interesting, guys. What's really interesting to me is that one of the clear pieces of information that I can take away from this, from the Aramaic and Greek evidence together, is there's an O in his name. That's interesting to me. Shalom, this is Nehemia Gordon, and I'm here today in Jerusalem with Professor Emeritus at Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Bezalel Porten. Professor Porten is best known as the editor of the Elephantine Papyri, one of the most important collections of documents in Jewish history. And he's a legend in this field of dealing with the Elephantine Papyri. In 1952, he began his doctorate, which eventually led him to collect and translate many of the Elephantine Papyri. And he just has some incredible stories and information we're going to hear about today. We're going to hear today about a Jewish temple in southern Egypt. We're going to hear about Jewish soldiers who were garrisoned in southern Egypt during the Persian period. We're going to hear about people who had names based on the Psalms. We're going to hear about people who were non-Jews who were keeping the Sabbath in the 4th and 5th century BC. I mean, incredible things that we don't hear enough about. Bezalel Porten here has discovered many of these things and translated them. Shalom, Professor Porten.
Shalom, Nehemia.
I actually met you, and it's incredible because I'm here. You're my neighbor. You're about a 10-minute walk from my apartment in Jerusalem, and I met you in Helsinki at the SBL conference, the International Society of Biblical Literature conference. You were doing a fireside chat there, and then later you came to my talk, and I said, we need to get together back in our home city and have a discussion about these Elephantine papyri. Professor Porten, I want to jump into it. Tell us what is, and I look around your apartment here in Jerusalem. One of the things I see is little cards with elephants on them and little figurines with elephants. What is Elephantine? Let's start with that. Elephantine in Egypt, and what are the Elephantine papyri and ostraca?
Well, first of all, Elephantine is the Greek translation of Yev, Yud Bet, which in Egyptian means elephant. And we have it in the Hebrew hybrid word Shenhav, which Hav, Hey Bet, Yud Bet, Aleph Bet, all three forms of elephant in ancient Egyptian.
And actually in Hebrew, Shenhav is ivory.
Ivory.
Meaning literally Shen is tooth, and you're saying Hav or Yav.
Hav is elephant.
So it's the
Elephantine is the translation into Greek of this place name.
Okay.
Usually the Greek names are names that sound like the Egyptian names, like Memphis sounds like Memphi.
Okay.
But this one is a translation.
Okay.
And in the 5th pre-Christian century, there was stationed on the island of Elephantine, which lies opposite Aswan, a Jewish military colony.
Wow.
And Aswan, we find concealed in the Aramaic name is Svein, Samach Vav Nun. And in Isaiah, in one of the passages, he speaks about the return of the exiles from the 4 corners of the earth. And the 4th corner is Eretz HaSinim.
Eretz HaSinim.
Eretz HaSinim. Now, in the Isaiah scroll, the 2nd Isaiah scroll from the Dead Sea, it's not Sinim, but Sveinim.
Okay.
Because the Yud and the Vav were pretty much the same. The Yud was a little chupchik and the Vav was a longer chupchik.
A chupchik is like a little bump, guys.
Okay. Right. And so it's Eretz HaSveinim.
Wait, so let me stop there for a second. Okay. So what did Isaiah originally mean when he wrote it? That's my question. Or when it was written down.
He meant the southern border of Egypt.
Okay. So Sinim in Isaiah refers to Aswan, is what you're saying.
Refers to Aswan.
Wow. Okay. And we know that. Okay. Very interesting. So from this textual variant in the Isaiah scroll, where we have a confirmation that at least the way it was understood when the Isaiah scroll was copied and maybe the original
The Jews were present in the southern part of Egypt.
Okay, so let's stop here for a second. Isaiah is talking about Jews coming back from the land of Aswan on the southern border of Egypt, and you have now evidence that there were Jews in Aswan. So how did they get there? What were Jews doing as a military colony? In other words, this wasn't a Jewish invasion, right? What were Jews doing garrisoned in the southern border of Egypt on an island in the Nile River? That's, I mean, incredible.
Well, in ancient times, you didn't go abroad to become a farmer. You went abroad because you had a job in the army, in the military.
Mm-hmm.
And the 26th dynasty in Egypt, the Say dynasty, made itself by bringing in mercenaries.
Okay.
And they brought in a lot of Greek mercenaries.
Okay.
And here we have evidence that they also brought in Jewish mercenaries.
Wow.
So Jews went down or up to Egypt in order to support the Egyptian king, the Sayyidic king, Semiticus. And it's a question of whether it was Semiticus the first or Semiticus the second.
Mm-hmm.
And then when the Persians conquered in 525, and now they think it's 526, the Jews already had a temple there.
So I want to stop you there. That was one of the most incredible things about, and maybe one of the most important things about the Elephantine papyri, and we'll get back to it, but that there was a Jewish temple with sacrifices in southern Egypt. And the sacrifices, we'll get back to that because the type of sacrifice is really interesting of how there were variations of what they brought. But in southern Egypt, there's this Jewish temple, which is eventually destroyed by this anti-Jewish pogrom, this attack on the temple. It's devastated by the worshippers of Chnum. I mean, let's get to that later. But these are just incredible things. Professor, I went to a Jewish day school, and then I went to a Jewish high school, and I maybe heard one or two sentences the whole time about the Elephantine papyri, and I think I learned more than most Jews certainly of my era about it, and I certainly never heard that there was a Jewish temple in Elephantine. Now, today you can Google it, so it's much easier to find out. But this is not something that, you have these incredible discoveries, and we're not being told about these things, certainly in popular Jewish culture. I don't know why that is. These are really important documents. So give me an approximate date of when the Jews came to Elephantine as these mercenaries.
Well, the relevant papyrus speaks of the fact that they were there before the Persians conquered.
Okay.
And I, for various reasons, placed their arrival at around 650.
Okay.
Before the Common Era.
And who is the king in Judah at the time of 650?
The king in Judah at the time of 650 was Manasseh.
And that's important because that's before Josiah destroyed the high places. So when these Jews came to Israel, there were temples on every hill and under every leafy tree, we're told in the Bible. And they come to Elephantine, and what do? They set up a temple, and they bring sacrifices. They're slaughtering animals, burning incense.
Well, they would have...
It's incredible.
You see, for every migration, there's a push-pull.
Okay.
Something pushes them out of the country.
Yeah.
And it was Manasseh's persecution that pushed them out. And what pulled them in was the invitation to become soldiers.
Wow.
Now, the temple needed priests. And so because of the paganization of the Jerusalem temple, the priests fled to Egypt and they set up their own temple.
Okay. So you're saying these were priests. Okay, this is interesting. So you're saying they were fled from the paganization of the Jerusalem temple. However, these priests weren't exactly, I'm not sure Jeremiah would have been very happy with these priests. Let's put it that way, from what I'm reading in these sources, or at least from the Jews, right? Because these Jews, and I don't know if we're going to jump into this already. I want to wait for it where we talk about who they were worshiping at Elephantine. But can you give us a little bit more of the background? So how many documents are there? What materials are they written on? Give us like a picture of, and the earliest ones are from what date until what date. Give us some, I want to get a general picture, and then I want to get into some of the details about about who these Jews worshipped and what they called him and her. Okay, so give us the overview though first.
Well, the documents stretch from 495 to 399.
Okay.
In other words, the whole 5th century.
Mm-hmm.
And papyrus was the standard writing material in ancient Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
And these Jews were a very literate people.
Mm-hmm.
And they wrote contracts on papyrus. They had houses, they had slaves, and they transferred the slaves, and they transferred the houses. They emancipated the slaves, and these are all written on papyrus contracts. Letters were also written on papyrus, and we have letters written by the Jewish leaders, one to another, telling about their experiences outside the country, inside the country, and popular stuff, day-to-day stuff, was written on scrap paper, and their scrap paper were ostraca. Now, an ostracon is a potsherd, a broken piece of pottery. This was the scrap paper of the ancient world. Mm-hmm. Now, in 5th century Athens, they would hold periodically a referendum. Do you want to hold an ostracism? And either they voted yes or no. And if they voted yes, then whom do you want to ostracize?
Oh, wow.
Now,
and what did it mean to ostracize?
Ostracize meant to kick them out for 10 years.
Oh,
That's
wow.
the way the democracy protected itself against the return of the oligarchy. And they would write the name of their most unfavored person on an ostracon. And so that's where we get the term ostracized.
Wow.
Ostracan.
Wow.
Now, these are little fragments, and Jews lived on the island of Elephantine, but they would serve on the mainland, which is Aswan, Svein, and they would write to their wives and brothers letters on ostraca, or at least there was an ostracan scribe who stood at the wharf of Aswan, and it's a couple 100 meters away, the ferry that would take them to Elephantine, and they would put their requests and their love feelings on these ostraca.
Wow.
And so that's the way we know that not only was their official legal language Aramaic, but their daily language was Aramaic.
Wow.
Because all of these Aramaic ostraca.
So let's talk about that for a second. So these documents, the ones pertaining to the Jews, because the Elephantine papyri and ostraca are written in many languages.
Right.
We have Egyptian, Demotic, we have various languages, Greek, but the Jews were writing in Aramaic, which is really interesting. So they leave around 650 BC in the time of Menasheh, and presumably they're speaking Hebrew in Judean. Like, that's not even disputed, right? That they're speaking Hebrew in Judea in 650 BC. And by about 150 years later, when we start to find their letters are in Aramaic. So how did that happen?
Well, Aramaic is the lingua franca of the Assyrian Empire that preceded the Babylonian Empire, that preceded the Persian Empire. Mm-hmm. And by the time the Jews reached Egypt, it was the language. And the Persians, as the Book of Esther said, ruled Mehodu Viat Kush, from India, Bactria, to Ethiopia, and the border between Ethiopia, or rather Nubia, and Egypt was Elephantine. So it was a border town.
Okay, that's really cool. So you have this statement in the Book of Esther. He ruled from India to Ethiopia, and we have Jews literally on the border.
Right.
That's awesome.
Right. Literally on the border.
Wow. And they're writing in Aramaic. And of course, one of the things that comes to mind for me is that when they're writing letters to the king of Persia, king of Persia, right? They don't write to him in Persian in the book of Ezra. They write to him in Aramaic.
Right.
Because that is the international language.
That's the international
being used.
language.
And that was the daily language of the Jews of Elephantine. So give us an approximate ballpark number. How many papyri Jewish papyri in Aramaic, and how many ostraca are there that have been discovered in Elephantine? I don't know, rough number of what are we talking about? Is there 10? Is there hundreds?
Well, we're talking about, let's say, give you a ballpark figure. We have three archives that I described in my book, Archives from Elephantine, and each one has about a dozen. And then there are random miscellaneous contracts. So let's say there are maybe 50 legal documents, and we have maybe that number or less letters. And we have a collection of letters that was found very surprisingly. It was found in a jar that was abandoned in an ibis cemetery, and it had about a dozen letters.
You said an ibis cemetery?
Ibis cemetery.
What is ibis?
Ibis is a sacred bird. It's got a long beak.
Wait. So there's a temple dedicated to ibis or something, or a cemetery dedicated to ibis, and we find a bunch of Jewish documents in that cemetery?
No, Aramean documents.
Oh, Aramean documents.
That's because the mailman who was supposed to deliver them from Memphis to both Luxor and Elephantine got tired, and he deposited them in a jar, and that happened in Italy.
Wait a minute. And I remember in your book, you talk about how some of these documents were actually signed and sealed and never been opened.
Right. Right. These letters have never been opened. They've never been delivered.
Wow. So you know what this reminds me of? There's that movie where the guy he works for FedEx and he crashes on this island. And then, decades later, he gets back to civilization. He delivers that final package. And here the package was never delivered. It was found 2,500 years later. Maybe 400 years later, some of them were found by archaeologists, others were found by, I guess, antiquities, let's call them generously, dealers. And here we have sealed, unopened documents letters that were never delivered literally by the mailman. That's
right.
Unbelievable.
Right.
That is incredible.
And these are Arameans.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting is that their names are either Egyptian names or Aramaic names.
Mm-hmm.
And the Jews, we have, as I said, several family archives, and they have witnesses, 4 witnesses, 8 witnesses, 12 witnesses, and the names of all those witnesses are good Hebrew names.
Wow. And
we have a list of contributors. Each one gave 2 shekels to the god Yahoo. That's the way he was called in Elephantine.
I can't let that go. Finish your sentence, and we got to talk about that.
They're all Hebrew names, the same that we find in the book of Jeremiah.
Mm-hmm.
So Arameans changed their names. They took Egyptian names. Jews did not. They kept their Hebrew names.
Wow. Okay, you mentioned how you mentioned the god Yahoo or Yahoo. Talk to us a little bit about how, and you're talking about what we know in Hebrew as Yud-He Vav-He, the Tetragrammaton. And actually, before we started, guys, Professor Porten, I was speaking the name the way I normally speak it, and he asked me not to speak that. So out of deference to him, I'm not going to. But the name Yud-He Vav-He, how is that written at Elephantine? Let's start with that.
Well, it was written Yud-He Vav.
And then sometimes Yud-He, right?
Now, in the earlier documents, and there was those that are the beginning of the 5th century, we have the spelling Yud-He.
Wow. Okay.
And in the Ostraka, we have the term Yahoo Tzvaot, which is translated the Lord of Hosts, meaning the military hosts. And there the name is written Yud-He. So just like the name Pharaoh, we pronounce it O at the end, but it's spelled with a Hey.
Okay.
And the place name Shiloh
Yeah.
We pronounce it O at the end, but it's written with a hey. So the final hey could be a vowel letter that would signify O.
Okay.
And so they would write Yud Hey Hey, and then they just changed it and wrote Yud Hey Vav.
So your suggestion is they pronounced it something like Yahoo.
Right.
Okay.
Yahoo.
Okay. Very interesting. Now, of course, we don't have vowels, so we don't actually know for sure how they pronounced it in these Elephantine documents, right?
Right.
What we do, what's really interesting, and maybe you want to talk about this a little bit, is that later we have in, for example, 4Q120 in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have a Greek document with a Greek text of the book of Leviticus, where the name is written Yota Alpha Omega, which is pronounced Ya'o. And some people have suggested that that is a continuation of this Aramaic form, Yud Hey Hey, Yud Hey Vav. What do you have any thoughts on that?
No, that is. In my book, I mentioned that in Greek texts, we do have that spelling, I-A-O. Yahoo.
So if you take that Greek form from 4Q120 in the Dead Sea Scrolls and you combine it with what we find in Elephantine, there's an Aramaic form of God's name, which is Yahoo, that's really interesting, guys. So that what's really interesting to me is that one of the clear pieces of information that I can take away from this, from the Aramaic and Greek evidence together, is there's an O in his name. That's interesting to me. So you mentioned how in the actual ostraca they mention Yahoo. Does that mean they spoke that name in Elephantine? The Jews of Elephantine, they spoke that name 500 years ago? Because later, of course, we have this, and even, you kind of alluded to it before we started, of the modern practice of not pronouncing the name. So is your understanding that at Elephantine they freely said Yahoo?
Yes.
Okay. Now, one of the things that really, I shouldn't say it surprised me. It did surprise me. When I was reading over the documents again, preparing for this, there's this reference to Elahaya. They in the Jewish documents of Elephantine in Aramaic, they mention Elahaya, which literally translates as gods. Now, you don't always know if that's plural or singular, right? Because Elohim is, and you even mentioned this in your book, could be majestic plural. But there's one place, and I may be mistranslating the Aramaic here, but it's something like Shalom Ehi Elahaya Yishalu. That is, it's saying, he's asking that the gods ask for peace for you, and their gods has a verb that's plural. So you can't say that's the majestic plural there, right? So talk to us a little bit about that, about this idea of that the Jews of Elephantine worshipped Yahoo, and they may have also worshipped, and we know for sure who they worship, but we'll get to that. Talk to us a little bit about that, Professor.
Well, it could be a standard greeting formula, and it occurs in letters.
Mm-hmm.
Friendly letters as distinct from very official letters.
Mm-hmm.
If the satrap, the governor of Egypt, would be writing a letter, he would get right down to the point. And he wouldn't say, how you doing, and may the gods bless you. But when you're writing to your friends or your family,
Mm-hmm.
then you do. And this is a standard formula. Shlam so-and-so, the welfare of so-and-so.
Mm-hmm.
Elahaya, the gods. Yishalu b'chol idan, may they seek at all times.
And it's they, right? So they're, at least in this formula, which may be a fixed formula, gods is plural.
Right.
Okay.
Since Elahaya is plural,
Mm-hmm.
then the verb would have to be plural.
Well, no. So you mentioned in your book the idea of majestic plural. In other words, we have in the Torah, of course, Bereshit bara Elohim. It's bara Elohim, not baru Elohim. In other words, there is this linguistic concept in Hebrew of a majestic plural. So it's not a given that Elahaya would be plural, a numerical plural, and have a plural verb. But in this case, it is in this formula. So, yeah, why is it? Did they worship multiple gods, or was this a fixed formula?
No, I think it's a fixed formula.
Okay.
And what they meant by it, we can't say.
Okay. Although it could be they worship more than one God. And let's jump into Jeremiah 44, guys, and this oath formula. Can you pull that up? there is a document from Elephantine which describes a man taking an oath. And the connection to Jeremiah 44 is uncanny. It's incredible. So here Professor Porten is opening up one of his books. How many volumes is this book?
4.
It's 4 volume, and the official title is?
Textbook of Aramaic Documents from Ancient Egypt. And this is written by myself and my late colleague, Dr. Ada Yardeni.
Professor, before we get this, can you say something about Ada Yardeni? You showed me something before we started that was just unbelievable. He showed me a photograph of a document of one of these papyri, and then he showed me the one-to-one full-size, I guess you would call it a transcription.
Right, hand copy. I call it hand copy.
A hand copy of the document. And if I showed this even to a specialist, I'm not sure they could tell, if they were both black and white, which was the photo, which was a hand copy. And that was Ada Yardeni. In other words, she traced every letter and every, as we say in Hebrew, every chupchuk of every letter to where it was identical, essentially, to the original, and then was available for study. And you have these in the book. I mean, she was an incredible scholar, Ada Yardeni. One of the really important things she did was she didn't just study the letters, she actually copied them out by hand and learned things by copying them out, right? I mean, tell us.
Right.
So tell us, I mean, we got to talk a little about Ada Yardeni, who recently passed away. Tell us about her.
Well, she was an artist. She was a graphic artist. And we got together about 40 years ago. And we went all over from Moscow to Brooklyn, wherever there were papyri or ostraka, and she copied them. And it was by copying the text that you were able to truly interpret it, because you saw the way the original writer wrote the letter.
Mm-hmm.
And the strokes. Letter
Wow.
had several strokes.
Wow.
And we reproduced these in full-size copies. And
Wow.
here is an example of what she's doing. And the remarkable thing about this letter is that it was apparently a palimpsest, because you can see here on the side are 2 lines that go the other direction.
So tell us what a palimpsest is.
A palimpsest is an erased text. Papyrus didn't cost nothing, and you would reuse the papyrus by the way they did it, erasing the writing and writing over it.
Okay, so this is a recycled piece of papyrus.
A recycled piece of papyrus.
With the second letter written on it. Okay, beautiful.
Right. So they didn't always have to erase it, because this one went this way, and this one went this way.
Wow.
Or the other way around. The one that's here, the original, went this way, but the one we have in front of us went this way.
So in other words, they turned it 90 degrees.
Right.
And then reuse and sometimes, guys, with palimpsests, you find incredible things. Let me just throw in the Cairo Geniza, they found a page of the Jerusalem Talmud, which was a palimpsest, and the lower level, which had been actually erased, they washed off the text, had Achilles' Greek translation of the Psalms of Tehillim, and in his Greek translation of Psalms, it has Yud He Vav He written in Paleo Hebrew letters. Little interesting side point about palimpsests. So sometimes you find some really surprising things. And here we have a palimpsest. And so is this the upper layer or the lower layer? Meaning, is this the second letter or the first letter that we're looking at?
No, we're looking at the one that the original, the second, the first one is
erased. Okay, we can still make out some of it, but it's mostly erased. Okay. All right. So
now, what was interesting, how did you preserve a papyrus? If it's like this, you fold it.
Yeah.
And on this, you can see the folds because it has these tears, and so
it's damaged on the folds.
So there are folds from A to G. And fold C is missing. So we have the beginning of this document, and then we have about 3-4 letters missing, and then we have the rest of the document. Now, how does one fill in the missing part? Well, I had a wonderful teacher, Professor H.L. Ginsberg, and he was also an expert in Aramaic, and he suggested for me how to restore this document. So you want me to read it?
First read it in Aramaic.
Okay, so it's Moma'a Zi Menachem Bar Shalom Bar Hoshaya or Hodaya Yama Li Meshulam Bar Natan Becherem Elaha Be Mazgeda Uve Anatyahu.
Okay, I got to stop you there. Anatyahu. So this is incredible. So we have all these Hebrew names that he just read, and then there's the word Beit Mizbach Madbacha or something, the house of slaughtering, and by
the house of prostration.
House of prostration. Okay, what was the Aramaic there?
Mazgeda. Sagid. Sagid means to.
Okay, all right.
That's what the Muslim does when he prays. I mean, God, he.
Well, that's interesting. So we have the house of prostration, and then by Anatyahu. So talk to us about this Anatyahu. That's just an incredible statement there.
Well, Anat we know is a deity, and it occurs very prominently in the Ugaritic documents. And Yahu is, of course, the deity the Jews of Elephantine. And Anat is feminine, and Yahu is masculine.
Wow.
So what could Anat Yahu mean? And different scholars would give different explanations. So it's the Anat is the wife of Yahu, and Anat is the something of Yahu, whatever Anat means.
In other words, this could be the wife of Yahweh.
And
is that right?
Well, it could be. It's a question of who put these two together. Did the people that worship Yahweh prefix Anat, or the people that worship Anat suffix Yahweh? But
this isn't so surprising, because if you have a bunch of Jews who leave Judah in the time of King Menasheh, and in the time of Menasheh, they were Jews who worshipped the God of Israel, along with consorts. And what do I mean by consorts? I mean a wife, right? In other words, we have two inscriptions, or actually more than a few inscriptions that mention Yud-He Vav-He and his Asherah, right? So this isn't such a great surprise that somebody is making this reference to let me read the English to Yahweh. The oath which Meshulam, the son of this, by the way, guys, the professor has a book here called the Elephantine Papyri that you can find it on Amazon. This is his translation. The oath which Menachem, the son of Shalom, son of Hoshaya or Hodaya, swore to Meshulam, son of Natan, by Cherem, the god, in the place of prostration, and by Anat Yahu. And he swore, saying, the Shias, which is in the hand of Pamis, son of Pamet, which you are bringing suit against me. So he's making some oath, okay? And he's swearing by the house of prostration, the house of worship, and by Anat Yahu. And an Anat Yahu is presumably something like the Anat related to Yahweh, to Yud-He Vav-He, to the God of Israel. Is that right? Is that a correct understanding? You
right.
Understand it?
Right.
So we have these people who are worshiping the God of Israel, Yud-He Vav-He, Yahweh, they call him. And alongside that, they're also worshiping Anat. And they're swearing by Anat and by the place of prostration. And you point out the comparison to Matthew 23:16 and verse 18, where someone swears by the temple, right? We have this reference in the New Testament to people swearing by the temple. And here they're swearing by a temple, by the place of prostration, and by Anat Yahu. So here I wonder, and this is me thinking out loud. When it says, may the gods ask for your peace, maybe they mean Yahweh and Anat, meaning that's not impossible, right? That's meaning, why just ask Yahweh? His wife maybe can ask for your peace as well.
Well, you have to distinguish between individual and communal.
Okay.
And an individual can swear by anyone, and we have all of these figurines in Judah.
Right. In other words, we excavate in Judea, or in Judah, in the kingdom of Judah in the 7th century BC, and we find idols in Jerusalem, and we think, oh, this can't be. We're not going to find idols in Jerusalem. But look at the prophets. Jeremiah said, the number of your cities are the number of your gods, O Judah, right? Meaning there was no lack of gods, meaning for the average person in Judah, there were many gods. They weren't supposed to have many gods, right? But if you asked one of the priests of the high places, what would he say to you? In other words, the priest of the high place that Josiah destroyed, would he say there's only one God? Or he'd say, yeah, there's only one God and he has a wife, right? So they found in Arad, they found it's actually been reconstructed at the Israel Museum. It's a little high place with a big altar and a little altar. And the standard explanation is it's Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh and his wife. It's the god and his consort. And then we have a reference in the Arad Ostraka where it mentions Beit Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, the house of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, right? Meaning like this was an altar there, or it was a temple, let's put it that way, at Arad. I mean, so I wonder if this isn't, it's not so crazy to think that maybe they had multiple gods. And then that ties into Jeremiah 44, which I'm not going to read the whole thing. But the people come to Jeremiah in chapter 44 and they complain. They said, you told us to stop worshiping the Queen of Heaven, and we did, and only bad things have happened to us, right? Meaning, here's how I was always taught growing up, that people do bad things, but they know they're bad. And here we have the people doing what, from the perspective of Jeremiah, is a bad thing, worshiping the Queen of Heaven. And they said, wait a minute, we're sinning. We should have kept worshiping the Queen of Heaven. Why did we stop? Only bad things have happened to us. And maybe Anat is that Queen of Heaven, right? I think you suggest that in your book. So, and then specifically the context there, I'm going to read this if it's okay, is swearing by the Queen of Heaven. So let me see if I can make this out here. Let's see. I love this. Verse 15 of Jeremiah 44. And they answered Jeremiah, all the people who know that their women were burning incense to other gods, and all the women were standing a great congregation, and all the people who were dwelling in the land of Egypt and Patros, saying, the words which you spoke to us in the name of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, we don't listen to you, for we did all the things that came out. Let's see. We did all the things that came out of our mouth to burn incense to the Queen of Heaven and pour libations to her, as we did in our fathers and our kings and our officers, right? This isn't just us. This is the official religion of the kingdom of Judah. We were burning incense and pouring libations to the Queen of Heaven. And we would eat bread, etc. And we didn't see any evil when we burned incense to the Queen of Heaven. And at the end of verse 17, verse 18, and from the time that we stopped burning incense to the Queen of Heaven and pouring out libations, chasarnu kol, we have been lacking everything. And we've been destroyed by sword and by famine. So this is incredible. So here they're complaining to Jeremiah, saying, look, we did what you told us to do, and only bad things happened to us. We should have kept doing what our kings did, burning incense to the Queen of Heaven and pouring out libations. And I love Jeremiah's answer. Guys, you've heard me talk about this in other contexts. Jeremiah 44. And Jeremiah said to the people, to the men, to the women, and all the people who answered him this thing, saying, etc. I'm going to jump ahead here. In verse 24, and Jeremiah said to the people and all the women, hear the word that Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh and all Judah who are in the land of Egypt. Thus says Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh of hosts, the God of Israel, saying, you and your wives who spoke with your mouth and you filled your hands, saying, we will surely keep the oaths which we have sworn to burn incense to the Queen of Heaven. And then he says in the next verse, therefore says Lord Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, etc., Behold, I swear by mine great name. There it is. He swears by his own name because they were supposed to be swearing in his name. That's in the Torah. And instead they're swearing by Anat Yahu, the Anat who is the wife of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, and they think they're doing righteousness. I'm filling in the part where they're swearing by Anat Yahu based on your papyrus, right? Jeremiah doesn't say the name of the Queen of Heaven. He just calls her the Queen of Heaven. He's saying, you're not going to ever swear by my name anymore as Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh lives. And here we have let's see, I don't know, this is more than 100 years after Jeremiah, someone who is still swearing by the Queen of Heaven in the name of Anat Yahu. I mean, this is incredible stuff, Professor. This is huge. This is huge stuff. Incredible. And one, it's a implementation of the prophecy of Jeremiah, right? He's saying they won't swear by his name, and then the guy isn't swearing by his name. He's swearing by a combination of the name Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh and Anat. I mean, this is incredible. And they don't speak his name. This is me saying this, not the professor. They don't say the name Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, they drop the Vav. Or they drop the Hey, right? They call him Yahweh. I mean, this is incredible stuff.
But you should also mention,
Yes.
He speaks about Patros.
Right.
Now, Patros is the district that includes Elephantine. It's a Persian, it's a Greek word.
There it is.
It's an Egyptian term. Pa, ta, resi. Pa, the, ta is country, and resi is south, the southern country. So it's what you would call the Negev. And he doesn't.
Deep south.
The deep south. So he doesn't mention Jeremiah Elephantine by name, but there are obviously Jews living in that whole area. They settled in the south.
So this is absolutely incredible. This isn't just an overlap. They're not just talking about similar things. Jeremiah is literally talking about the thing that continued at Elephantine, and now we found the papyrus that actually fills in some of the gaps and helps us understand. I mean, this is incredible stuff, Professor. Would you come back and continue to talk about some other things here? What I really want to talk about when we come back in the next episode is the Passover letter and some of the other, and this woman, Miftachia, who is, there's a woman whose name is related to the sun. This is incredible stuff. Would you come back and continue this, Professor?
I shall.
Wonderful. And would you end with the Aramaic prayer, and maybe you would do us the honor of doing it in the singular of Yishal instead of Yishalu? Would you end with a prayer formula? Just idea came to me. If you're willing to do it, end with the kind of prayer formula we would find, without mentioning a knot, in Elephantine Papyri.
Well, Shlam Nehemia Elah Shmaya Yishal B'chol Idan. It means the welfare of Nehemia, may the God of heaven seek after at all times.
Amen.
You have been listening to Hebrew Voices with Nehemia Gordon. Thank you for supporting Nehemia's Makor Hebrew Foundation. Learn more at nehemiaswall.com.